our next speaker is Dr. Yani Singh, who is coming to us from, I think, Bhopal. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Yani works at the a university in Bhopal and is helping run the Center for Non-Killing. So she can explain herself. Do introduce yourself and then give us your remarks.
Okay.
Welcome.
Good evening to all the esteemed panelists, firstly. And I would firstly express my gratitude to Dr. Thomas for inviting me to participate in this webinar where it is being attended by such intellectual scholars. So I have basically completed my PhD on non-killing. The topic of my PhD was non-killing and global peace, a study of emerging paradigms and prospects. So basically we have been following the ideology which was laid down by Glen Page in his seminal work, Non-Killing Global Political Science. So pursuing that work, I wrote my thesis, which we were also able to manage to publish it into a book that was the non-killing paradigm for world peace and enlightenment. So we are trying to study the problem that we are being faced with from the lens of non-killing. So our idea of judgment of the peace of for any society is basically surrounded as to how much killings go on around a particular country. So for that we developed a non-killing index, and we took over there 5 parameters. That was the homicide rate, the suicide rate, the capital punishment deaths, and war related deaths. So that's what I am basically here to speak about. The topic which I have chosen to speak about is philosophy, religion, and non-killing. So to start with this, I just want to state that how philosophies developed, how religion came into existence, and how gradually with time they changed their path. So the 18th and 19th century basically had witnessed the development of various political philosophies that included German idealism, transcendentalism, Marxism, existentialism, positivism, and social Darwinism. Now, all these philosophies were different from each other in the sense that they differed from in the means and objectives. That is to say, if their goals were similar, the methods advocated by them to achieve those goals differed. So, for instance, the ideology or the philosophy of idealism and transcendentalism were based on ethics and morality as the way of human progress. While as on the other hand, we had the philosophy of utilitarianism and communism that focused on collective good and happiness. Now, philosophies differed, but there was one thing that united them all, and that was the objective of human civilizational progress. Each philosophy was developed with that objective, that they want to achieve human civilizational progress. In fact, even religions were formed with that very same objective. But as we witness the developments of the last few centuries, we'll see that technology and scientifically progress has been made in various fields. But I'll say the consciousness and the morality had altogether declined. This claim we are making on the basis of the facts that the war deaths, the homicide rates, the suicide rate, the state killings in form of capital punishment, the mass killing, the genocides, and terrorist related deaths have increased. Now, amidst these problems and crises, it becomes imperative for us to understand and to examine the philosophies which we are advocating. Are these philosophies really helping us in protecting the human life which they were initially framed, or these philosophies are actually complicating life and threatening life itself. So the question basically which I want to understand is what should be given more importance? A philosophy, an ideology, a belief, a religion, or human life itself? Now, each society is being faced by different set of problems. Therefore, we need to find different solutions for them. Like, for instance, the homicide rate is found to be more prevalent in Latin American countries, while as you'll observe, the suicide rates are high in countries like India and Sri Lanka. So this reflects the fact that some countries are facing societal fault lines, while as some others are facing political crisis, political instability, or economic instability. So killings in all these places are basically occurring or being fueled in the name of religion or in the name of ideology. So in order to understand that, we need firstly to have a non-killing index. So I tried to formulate that index for 2015 and 2016, but because of limitation of data, we were not able to proceed further onwards. Because the suicide rate was something which even the global peace index does not measure, and so there were certain limitations with regard to data collection. So I will not ponder upon this more. I just want to move on that now a situation is arising that we need to understand that the system, ideology, and religion, all these are being operated by humans who are ultimately political leaders or religious leaders. And they use these very ideologies and religions to wield power, which ultimately perpetuates the killings, disturbs the peace of society, and also creates chaos and anarchy in state. So what I want to convey is religion does not kill, ideology does not kill, but terrorist leaders have killed in the name of religion. Mao had killed for communism. Hitler and his likes had committed genocide to purify the races. So basically, what gave them the authority, or what gave them so much of power by which they were able to practice such large mass killings without being checked properly in time? So what I believe is that happened because these leaders were believed to be most sincerely committed to the ideologies or to the religion which they were advocating. And perhaps this notion gave them the right to attack the life of the other sections of society. So the over here the problem is we have not defined the concept of defined the definition of religion and philosophy along with the objectives properly. For layman people, and even the Oxford Dictionary defines religion as a belief and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. But if you go to the intellectual philosophers' definition about religion, you will get a different meaning of religion. Like, for instance, according to Rabindranath Tagore, an Indian philosopher, he states that the world is endless and humans must find their place to fit and work in that area where they realize their own truth and find their fulfillment. And this is their religion. Religion is not about the God of cosmic force, but rather about the God of human personality. Similarly, we have Karl Marx, who explains religion in a different context. He says that the self consciousness and self esteem of a man who has either not yet won true to himself or has already lost himself again. So, in simple words, to put it in simple words, religion was a source of uplifting human beings by giving them a framework for goals and behavior. It was a means, an instrument to give solace to the people. In the words of Karl Marx, it was an opium of the masses to give them relief in time of need. But because of the manipulation of religion by power holders in history, the very essence of religion was lost. In the name of religion, there were crusade wars, just wars, jihad continues till date. So the lives lost in these instances are unaccounted for. The freedom from women and other section of society was also taken away. So basically, what are the points that we first need to ponder upon is, do we all have the same understanding of the term religion? If no, which I believe is actually the case, can we do something to have a universal understanding of the term? Third point, how do we handle the killings that occur in the name of religion or philosophy? Fourthly, how do we create reverence for human lives? Because that is something which is largely lost in today's time. And last point, can something be done at institutional level to raise awareness about religion, about human dignity, and about human life? Because these are the very sources of conflict. And to prevent a conflict, we need to go to the root cause of it, not just to the manifestations. So herein, I would like to bring back to everyone's attention the idea of non-killing. So non-killing was basically an idea that calls not just to stop killings, but also to stop those conditions that lead to killing. A world that is unjust, where there is discrimination, where there is prejudice, that type of world would naturally cause killings and chaos in society. The law, police, and state would only come into action once the crime has been committed. So why are we waiting for the crime to be committed? Why not take an action beforehand? For that, I believe that changes would need to be initiated from family level, from peer groups, from schools and colleges, because it is ultimately these forces that shape the personality of individuals. With that, I would just conclude my talk, and I thank you all for patiently listening to me. And please do let me know about your thoughts about the non-killing index, because we want to further improve the index. Like for instance, we have not included indirect deaths which are caused through some industrial disaster, like for example the Bhopal gas tragedy case, or I would also mention the Chernobyl disaster case, which according to me was also a kind of state killing, because the state had knowledge about the malfunctioning of the Chernobyl factory. And that's the thing which I would like to have a suggestion as to how further we can enhance the non-killing index. What parameters can be included to measure the killing rate? Thank you, all of you.
Right, thank you very much, Katyayani. An excellent talk. What I'll do at the end, with permission, is I'll send everybody's emails, like and then you can communicate. And if you have thoughts about this non-killing index, you can contact Katyayani. And I think certainly it should include ecological disasters, things like Chernobyl and stuff, obviously. And they are state crimes. And leukemia is produced off by Windscale in Britain, the nuclear power plant. A friend of mine has documented this, but these are state crimes being hushed up, you know, technological, ecological crimes. Okay, thank you so much. That's really important. Now we move on to our guest from Moscow, I think. He's in Russia, Professor Alexander Chumakov. Can you hear me, sir? Alexander.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas.
You introduce yourself, tell them a bit about yourself, and then give us your talk, sir.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, once again. And I think it's very good that the World Intellectual Forum, and especially you, Thomas, and Dr. Svaminathan also has taken an important initiative to hold this international online conference. Now it is time for intellectuals to get together and share their views. Why is this so important? I think because against the background of modern globalization and the coronavirus pandemic, there is a lot of talk that the pandemic has suddenly and dramatically changing our world. But this is only partly true. In fact, if we look more closely, there is nothing unusual or unexpected about what is happening. For those who are seriously engaged in global studies, it is quite obvious that one set of such or similar situation was a matter of time. In other words, sooner or later, this was to happen. Why? Because we have long been living in a global interdependent world, but humanity as a whole does not respond adequately to these. Yes, today they only talk about coronavirus and the consequences that are still ahead of us. We have already paid a heavy price for inattention to the knowledge accumulated in global studies. But that's not all. Clearly, the economic and social consequences will be dire. The point is that nation states will strengthen their role in world affairs, and talk of a unipolar world will finally give way to the concept of multipolar world. But there is no solution. Problems will not subside and dangers will not diminish. Is the threat of the outbreak of a full-scale bacteriological warfare or pure fantasy? Or has the potential threats of nuclear war become less? But if such a war happens, and this is quite possible for those who survive the coronavirus pandemic, will seem like child's play. There are many other global issues, but what has already been said is enough to accept that it is no longer possible to ignore global processes and their negative consequences, or to underestimate their objective historical character. Let's turn to the story. 50 years ago, the Club of Rome, with its reports, did not just hit the bell. He began to sound the alarm, trying to awaken the world community before the threats of global problems. And what is the result? 9 years after the establishment of the Club of Rome, its first president, Aurelio Piquet, writes, following his words, following the example of Diogenes, who was looking for a real person, we constantly wandered around the world in search of good people who could join our endeavor of somehow supporting. But our words found no more response than the Pope's sermons, the exhortations of the United Nations Secretary General Rutan, or say the warming of concerning scientists and thinkers. It seems that our words were forgotten even before they had. Now, when not 9, but 50 years have passed, we unfortunately have to state that the problem remains. Yes, Of course, now in the world there are many centers and specialist courses at various universities and so on and so on and so on. However, people around the world continue to behave as if nothing has changing fundamentally around. And then nature, and someone will say God, it's okay, makes its own adjustments. So the crisis comes. Just such a crisis we are now worrying. Now it has declared himself as one global problem. But if we don't draw the right conclusions and put them at the basis of our joint actions, the crisis will become systemic and permanent. And the price of overcoming such a crisis will increase many times over. However, while we are alive, do not fall into pessimism and despondency. We can and must act, and the sooner we start, the better. At the same time, one must act with knowledge and of the matter and with awareness of our responsibility for what is happening. And here is the special role of science, philosophy, culture, education, and enlightenment. Then what can and should we do, scientists, engaged in global studies, at a minimum, along which research and teaching activities appeal to reason, raise a voice in defense of peace and nature. Write appeals, proclamations, recommendations to decision makers, and finally conduct a wide explanatory work. As it has long been correctly said, ideas become material strengths when they take over the masses. That is why what is already well known to us should become the property of wide public consciousness. And first of all, this applies to those who make decisions at all levels of government. Regardless of the worldview, religious and political positions, it should be clear to everyone that under the influence of globalization, by the beginning of the 20th century, humanity has completely become global. And this means that we need a new look at history, culture, and civilization. Namely, now we need a cultural come civilizational view of various societies and humanity as a whole, where there are many cultures and civilization is one. This approach is not only possible one, but its advantage is that it fixes attention on the unity of the cultural and civilizational development of any society. Nevertheless, it is important to emphasize that the underestimation of both cultural diversity and civilizational unity of the world community still continues to be the domination line of behavior of the largest states of the modern world. However, there is no alternative to single humanity, and therefore, in the interest of preserving civilization on the planet, not only principles and rules common to everyone should be established, but also shared responsibility for the fate of each person. But from the fact that the world community has found a common home, a common destiny, and a shared responsibility for what is happening in the world. It does not yet follow that the rules and principles of organizing public life that are common to all will be automatically accepted by the rest world community. Thus, humanity needs to seek compromises. In modern conditions, this is the most optimal way to solve world problems. In this context, it is evident that overcoming socioeconomic backwardness and rising quality of life for a large part of human population are the most acute problems of modernity. Without solving them, there can be no global civilization possible to build. But what is even more important and more difficult task is forming the new thinking and relevant world outlook for people who mostly just don't catch up with the dynamics of the changing taking place around them. Many people, and especially adults, have problems in adjusting to the new world, which is an open arena for freely competing and collating ideas, paradigms, and values. It is even more difficult to leave the familiar cave of the established opinions, myths, and ideologies. But it seems evident they are facing the second Excel time, the earth of dialogue. It requires deep transformation of our consciousness, similar to the transformation of nymphs into butterfly. An important step on this path of changes is transition from a discrete vision of society described in self-sufficient categories of culture, civilization, or globalization to a complex systemic vision of it, where a dynamic social body is perceived in a different way through the prism of cultural civilizational development, including its global level. I would like to hope that our conference dedicated to global thinking for peace and sustainability will make contribution to the solution of this extremely important task. Thank you very much for your attention.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Chumakov, for your words. And I wish you could read it in Russian, and then we could hear it in English. One day we'll get the translation that sophisticated. But thank you so much for your contribution. Can I suggest, if people do have a written paper, could you send it by email to me if you have it in writing, and I can circulate these so that we can have a chance to reflect on each other's thoughts. Right, now we're moving on to our Slovenian colleague. Marko Hren is joining us from Ljubljana, I believe. And Marko is on the World Intellectual Forum for Slovenia. And we met in India several times and has done a lot of deep thinking on, let's say, the future of religion and the overlap with spirituality and with science. So Marko, welcome. Do introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We met in Jaipur and in Delhi for the conferences on nonviolence and nonviolent action. World Intellectual Forum, we decided during those occasions that we shall open a debate on reconceptualization of spirituality. Many speakers today thanks to you, Thomas, inviting us in this circle, have opened the question on how we understand religion, dharma, spirituality. Much of the thinking has been done on that, but it is clear that we need to come up to a reasonable interpretation of the evolution of spirituality. We have heard your thoughts on the chart of religion's periodic table, and with Ian Fry, who will speak later on, we have formed a little group within WIF, and I would like to invite the speakers that are interested in this topic to cooperate, to push this thinking on the evolution of the concepts of spirituality over time. The colonized population of the world, and this is majority population of the world, did lose their direct link to original spiritualities of their nations, which are strictly linked to their habitats, their microcosmos, their micro systems of living, and to the language. Thomas, you started with linguistic. I wrote an issues paper for the WIF group on reconceptualization of spirituality, and I will share it with you after this meeting, where Ian and myself, we suggest some tools and some key issues that should be taken into account while rethinking the role of spirituality. And now I get to the question of why this is of key importance to come up with a modern, contemporary understanding of spirituality in the times of challenges of today. Now, if we look at the immediate impact of the present COVID crisis, we can identify at least the following baskets of impacts, immediate effects of the COVID crisis. First of all, it is the fact that majority of world states, the parliaments, have made substantial changes in the jurisdiction that allows for more control of population, including the limits to the human rights and limits to the mobility. That's a separate basket of issues that I want to put front. But I will focus in my little contribution to this meeting on the second basket of the immediate impacts of the COVID crisis. The second basket is dealing with exponent penetration and exponent uptake of the digital technologies. I don't know if you're aware, but the telecom operators and the service providers increased the broadband capacities dramatically. The growth and uptake of digital technologies, including the one that we are using right now, is exponent. The education systems in all COVID countries practically, at least for a couple of months, moved to remote education modes. Slovenia, for example, is the case, where higher education completely moved to digital, and my kids in school were in remote education system for 3 months. And India, as you know, at the moment is largely teleworking, working remote, due to the situation. So the uptake of digital technologies is extreme in supply chains, in education, in the teleworking sense. What does that mean? What is immediate impact? It is a test of global digital society. And at the same time, the second issue is it is a test on the potential impact of dramatic reduction on mobility, both cargo and mobility of people. The effects in terms of reduction of pollution have already been made. This is a direct link to the question of global warming and potential measures to stop the warming at 3 degrees with radical measures on mobility. But when we opened several speakers today, particularly Professor Siddhartha and Professor Aaron Shikar, the question on the need to rethink the spirituality, I will here only mention a couple of the issues related to digital technologies, and particularly the take-up of artificial intelligence in relation to the need that we equip population with a reasonable spirituality understanding. I will send you an issues paper where I map this relationship very clearly and transparently. So what is the relation of spirituality concept and the Industry 4.0? Industry 4.0 meaning digital, artificial, mechanicalized. So artificial intelligence and digital technologies have a very strong potential of further alienating the population from nature and from realities, including from societies. One of the studies that have been done recently on the influence of remote education on kids and the alienation of kids from their group dynamic is showing disastrous results. So the alienation is a big problem that caused many environmental and social damage on the planet already. But the digital technologies and artificial intelligence have a potential to further push societies into this alienation concept versus true relations with nature, with society, amongst people. And that's where spirituality conceptualization comes in directly, equipping people with means and philosophy to develop and nourish the genuine relations and links towards nature, towards microcosm, and towards macrocosm. Alienation, as you all know, leads to ignorance. And ignorance is the baseline humus for injustice, which leads to hatred and potentially killing and wars. Whilst the developing spirituality approach towards everything means developing true relations, introspective and other means of relations with the micro and macro, developing empathy, compassion, solidarity, and of course, at the end, non-violence and peace in societies. So in my view, and I argue this point throughout my issues paper that I offer to you, is that spirituality in this situation is even more important, if not a decisive component of our philosophical approach towards the present crisis. So our role and that's where I see our role as the intellectual forum and the group meeting today is to foster the adaptation of understanding of spirituality to all societies. Maybe India is luckily a bit exempted, since Indian society, thanks to preservation of original understanding of Vedas, maybe Dr. Kothari will correct me, is a bit exempted and has a privileged position to promote a new contemporary understanding of transition to sustainable development using Vedic principles. But Dr. Katari will speak later on, and we have him on board. So I think that it is of utmost importance to religion, but spirituality, such as a concept, in fostering autonomous decision making by people in the times of crisis, independent cognition, using of brain, as we have heard before, for independent cognition, for autonomous thinking and decision making, versus relying on artificial intelligence, which is penetrating our society with rapid speed, really, and in such a way empowers citizens to seek for truth, which is in this context, of course, even more important. I think that we shall remember, and this is my last point, we shall remember that today in the public discourse, we almost don't hear a question on what is the root cause of the COVID pandemic. We all know and study the data that make us think that the virus was produced in labs. I must say that it's not only our independent thinkers' cognition, but for example, main epidemiologist of Slovenia expressed that publicly, that her assumption of situation based on data is that it is quite probable that the virus was produced intentionally in labs, and that it's less probable that the virus mutated naturally in different environments around Wuhan. So if we need to seek for truth and request the truth behind it, and then we will deductively more easily see why the impacts of the COVID crisis after 8 months are already such as I very schematically sketched a few minutes ago. So this would be my contribution for today's meeting. Thank you, Thomas, and the speakers before me. You made it more simpler for me to make some key points that I wanted to pass to. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Marko. And I think the point you made at the end is incredibly important. We don't actually know for certain the cause of this pandemic, and it's ridiculous. 6 months later, and our lives are turned upside down. And as some of you know, I've suggested we go down the route of invoking the Bioweapons Convention, which has the official authority under the UN to investigate all the labs that could have made this. And I've been attacked for this by people saying, no, it's just accidental and all that. But I take the view of Sir Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, who I met, that a scientific proposition, which is this was a natural occurrence, to be scientific, you have to be able to disprove it. We could disprove that or not by investigating the labs. And if it turns out everyone's innocent, no, this is totally natural, then we will know for sure. I would like to suggest, therefore, the World Intellectual Forum, we should take a lead in this. And if you have contacts with the epidemiologist in Slovenia, if she is saying there's some doubt, I'm in touch with other scientists saying the same. We should bring them together. We should have another Zoom meeting like this in a month and get the scientists together and share their doubts. Because, as I said, I come from near where Descartes was born. We have to doubt. That's the job of philosophers. There are scientists saying it's made naturally, bats, or there's others saying it's in a lab. Bring them together. Our job is to be in the middle, suspend judgment and doubt. So that's a very important suggestion and a bit of information you shared, Marko. So thank you. And as a fellow European Union resident, I think we have a duty in Europe to do this. Right, so now we come on to our next speaker, who is the grandfather of the World Parliament and Constitution Association, and is a tireless advocate that the solutions to the problems of the world are by some kind of world governance system. And Glen, are you still with us?
So I'm mute. Can
There
you
you
hear?
are.
Can you hear me?
Do introduce yourself, this time as a philosopher, and the floor is yours, sir.
Okay. I'm a professor of philosophy at Radford University and founder of the Peace Studies program there. And I have to differ with Tom. I'm not the grandfather of the World Constitution Parliament Association, but Philip Isley was a previous generation. He founded that association in 1958, and I've been president of it for a number of years, but it was flourishing worldwide long before I got involved with it. I'd like to try to integrate in the few minutes talk time that I have. I'd like to try to integrate the concept of spirituality, the concept of institutions, and look at the dynamics of our problems all of you have so far faced with. We've got these very serious problems on this planet that we have to deal with. The problem not only of peace, but integrated with that, the problem of sustainability, of the collapsing environment, of violence everywhere. A number of thinkers have articulated a very simple hierarchy of stages of cognitive and moral growth, as I'm sure you know. Lawrence Kohlberg did this, and Ken Wilber has affirmed this, Carol Gilligan, and so on. And I think, of course, there's different ways to articulate spiritual development in the stages of growth. There's not just one correct way, but I want to use this as a starting point, just to lay out the field that we're looking at. So Ken Wilber talks about the young, the childish cultures, the childish human beings as they begin. He calls this the egocentric stage. That when we're young, it's me, I. And then these thinkers talk about the process of acculturation. We become interacting with our community, our parents, and so on. We become socialized, and we move to what they have called the ethnocentric stage, where the culture and the language and the religion, the environment that we find ourselves in as young people seems common sense, seems natural. And so other cultures and languages and seem different from us. They seem less coherent with what we take to be reality and so on. And of course, we eventually, if we keep growing, we keep developing, we realize that that's not the case, that the world is a plethora of many different cultural perspectives, and they all have great validity and great truth to them in different ways. And so we move eventually, as we continue developing, to what these thinkers call the world-centric level. We begin to see that we live on one planet, one world, one civilization, and we transcend our ethnocentric prejudices as much as, you know, in a progressive way. We may continue to do this throughout our lives, but so on. But then these thinkers like Ken Wilber speak of a higher level beyond the world-centric, where we become what they call cosmocentric. We begin to feel an affinity with the basic imperatives coming from the universe, the basic resonance of the universe, the basic ground of being. Perhaps we could call it God, and so on. There are, as you may know, people like Ken Wilber have articulated a number of levels of spiritual development in this cosmological stage. It's not just one stage, but we can keep becoming more fully aware of the divine ground of the cosmos throughout our entire lives. There's many stages that might be identified here, but I want to also bring in here a concept that was developed by Cohen and Beck in their book Spiritual Dynamics, in which they give a series of stages. You may be familiar with this too. More complex than the 4 stages I just identified. They have about 8 stages, but they make a certain point that the highest stages, right, the stages in which they call integrated or integral, are stages which they identify as second tier. Second tier stage means that we human beings then become conscious of the process itself, the evolutionary process, that before in the first tier it's happening, we may grow, but we're not able to direct it. It's a kind of natural process of growth. But in second tier, we become capable of conscious evolution, right? And that's probably what all of us are doing in this meeting right now. You know, we're in some ways we're all involved in trying to consciously evolve our human condition beyond the condition of war and injustice and violence and so on. So I want to bring up this this idea of development and growth, and affirm that, as some of you have already suggested, that this is absolutely essential for human beings. We have to find ways to cultivate growth to the world-centric and beyond that to the cosmocentric level for as many people as possible. Certainly for a significant minority that may serve as, you know, the 100th monkey syndrome and become something that is a catalyst for changing human thinking on the planet as much as possible. That's my first point, this process that needs to be done. My second point has to do with a paper that I wrote recently called the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a World System Ideology. And there I looked at the UN development goals in some detail, 17 goals. As you know, these goals have superseded the Millennium Development Goals that were in place from the year 2000 to 2015. So the new goals are in place from the year 2015 to the year 2030. But even the Millennium Development Goals superseded the Agenda 21 goals of the Rio de Janeiro Global Environmental Conference and so on. The UN, since its first meeting on the environment in 1972, has been trying to deal with global climate collapse, and it has failed, right? With each successive meeting, they recognize that the climate is still collapsing. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is getting ever more vocal about the dangers that we're facing and the need for immediate transformation. So I looked at these sustainable development goals in some detail, and I looked at the structure and functioning of the UN system, also the UN Charter. As you probably know, recently Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, spoke before the UN, and he pointed out that the Charter was written in 1945 in a very different world than the world we're living in today. And he said, we really need to be thinking in terms of reviewing that Charter, changing that Charter. And, you know, I agree with that, although I would go beyond what he said to something much more fundamental. In my, the charter is based on two assumptions that were fundamental about the world in 1945. And I argue that these two assumptions, and actually there's a third assumption as well, have become part of the life world. They have colonized the life world of most of the people who staff the United Nations and indeed the international bodies that are concerned with the world. This is, you may know, this comes from idea, in large part comes from Jürgen Habermas's idea that when he talks about the theory of communication, that the basic systems of the world, which are both capitalism and nation-state bureaucratic systems, he says have colonized the life world for people. We're born into these systems where they're so pervasive. There's so much in the background of everything we do and say that we don't even self-consciously, we're not even able to bring them fully to self-consciousness. They're part of, that's what he means by they're colonized our life world. We just assume them without thinking about them. I was thinking about this a little bit when Dr. Singh was talking about nonviolence. I would recommend, if you want, Dr. Singh, if you want thoughts about nonviolence, I'd look at the global capitalist system, right? It's a system, as some thinkers have pointed out, of global genocide, right? Millions of people die every year. This is a system that's been going on for 5 centuries. And the result of it is that 5% of the world's population own 95% of all the wealth in the world, and half the world is living in hell. Inadequate food, inadequate resources, in terrible slums, no sanitation, and so on. It's a result of a system of violence, right? This is a capitalist system, is a system of violence. And it's the same, so this is colonized. If you look at the UN decisions, the UN way of operating, and in GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the World Trade Organization, the UN uses of the Bretton Woods systems, the World Bank and the IMF, you see that capitalism is an assumption behind what the UN does. It's trying to address poverty and the problem of development, as it calls it, with loans, interest-bearing loans provided by private banking institutions, which the World Bank is. It's a consortium of private profit-making banks that then loan to the world. It requires structural adjustment, that is, it forces countries to do things that are against their own interests so that they can be penetrated by foreign capital, claiming that this is the best way for them to develop and so on. The UN has these basic problems because of these assumptions that aren't questioned. And the other fundamental problem, the other two fundamental problems are technological rationality, which Habermas also says has colonized the life world of people. We tend to think in technical solutions rather than larger communicative solutions that aren't just the manipulation of things as they are in different ways. And secondly, the system of so-called sovereign nation states, right? The so-called Westphalian system, which was first articulated, many scholars say, in 1648 in the Peace of Westphalia in Germany, and since then has proliferated worldwide, so that we now live in a world which assumes that there's something natural about this world, we assume, and that is that we have divided ourselves into nearly 200 absolute territories with absolute borders, most of which are militarized, Every one of these sovereign nations has the right to militarize itself and be suspicious of other nations and think in terms of national security and so on. It is a system that is inherently a war system. And this goes right back to the 17th century when the system was first formulated. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes in England said, they're like gladiators, right? And maybe we can establish, Thomas Hobbes said, maybe we can establish peace within nations, right, by having a powerful government to keep the peace. But he says between nations, it's a war system. They're gladiators. And this has been true ever since that time. Well, only in the 17th century, they were fighting with swords. In the 21st century, they're fighting with supersonic missiles carrying nuclear weapons, right? It is insane. This system of sovereign nation states in the 21st century is just insane. And yet the UN system is predicated on it. It assumes it. It assumes that we can solve the problem of sustainability or the problem of peace without changing these basic frameworks of that structure our world, the framework of capitalism and the framework of militarized sovereign nation states. And that's, in my view, that's just false. We'll never solve this problem unless we transform our world in that direction. Okay, so that's my second point. That my third point is that there's a dialogue, a dialectic between spiritual growth and development and the kind of institutions under which we live our lives. Right? There are many thinkers. Erich Fromm comes to mind as one who have pointed this out in some detail in their writings. Erich Fromm was a psychologist, an immigrant from Germany during the Second World War, we want to transform human beings to higher levels, to a world-centric spiritual level, to a cosmocentric spiritual level, so that we live in harmony and peace and love and justice and caring and compassion with one another. But we do not do this, and it's not going to happen as long as we have a global capitalist system exploiting people, alienating people, putting people in competition with one another, making us think that we can't trust one another. We're not cooperating to provide the food, clothing, and shelter that all of us need. Instead, we're colonizing markets and colonizing economic processes in order to make that tiny elite of the top 5% ever richer and richer, never solving the problems of the starving masses, the poor. And the second with the sovereign nations, as long as we have this system, people grow up in it. They think it's natural. I'm Russian, I'm Indian, I'm American, I'm this, I'm that. It colonizes our life world. And it prevents us from developing a truly world-centric and beyond that cosmocentric and spiritually realized consciousness. So unless we change these systems, right? If you have a different system, it's going to it's going to influence people's life worlds in a different way. It's going to transform those life worlds, right? And that's where as Tom said a little while ago, he thinks I'm the grandfather of the World Constitutional Parliament Association, which I'm not, but that's why I work night and day to support the Constitution for the Federation of Earth, because it transcends sovereignty. It doesn't get rid of the nations, right? There's a House of Nations. In the World Parliament, there's a House of Peoples. All people are represented democratically. A House of Counselors, where wise people and highly educated people get into government. And a House of Nations, where all the nations are represented and have a voice. But this this Constitution does say in Article 2 that the people of Earth are sovereign. It's our planet, it's our resources, it's our future that is at stake. It's not this nation versus that nation who's economically, you know, the Chinese Silk Road versus the US resistance to that road. This is destroying our future, this kind of sovereign nation orientation. And,
look, sorry to interrupt, Glenn, but you're 7 minutes over time, and we need to move on to
I'm
our
sorry.
next speaker. Thank you so much.
I'm not good at following time.
We know you're as articulate as ever, but what we're going to do is get through all the speakers and then have a bit of a discussion at the end. I'm sure people will want to ask, you know, like how we get there from here. As I said to Nathan. So we'll save that discussion.
I'll just mention that I'll send by chat the URL of our new website, which does talk about how to get there from here.
Okay, so if
people can look at it.
If you find the way, I'm sure we'll all be coming after you. And Glen is, as I said, everyone on this panel could give I'm sure, a 2-hour lecture on philosophy and ethics. There's some great minds gathered.